And we are taking you live to Johannesburg now, where the leaders of the group known as BRICS are meeting for a summit. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Let's listen to the South African President, Cyril Ramaphos.
Chair of the BRICS Business Council, Ms. Busi Mabuza. Chair of the BRICS Women's Business Alliance, Ms. Lebogang Zulu. Honorable ministers and all guests here present, members of the diplomatic corps who are here with us, I'd like to welcome you all to South Africa and to the 15th BRICS Summit. This is the open session of our summit, so it's a pleasure and a joy to have all of you here. The BRICS partnership straddles 4 continents and 5 countries that are home to almost 3.5 billion people who live on this planet. Over the past decades, the bloc has been a major driver of global growth, of global trade and investment as well. BRICS stands for solidarity and for progress. BRICS stands for inclusivity and for a more equitable order. BRICS also stands for sustainable development. We are an inclusive formation of developing and emerging economies that are seeking to work together to benefit from our rich histories, our rich cultures, and systems to advance the prosperity of the peoples of our countries. We do so because we know that poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment are the biggest challenges facing humanity. We are therefore determined that the BRICS partnership, which has been growing in importance and influence over the years, must be harnessed to drive an inclusive global economic recovery. Advancing the African agenda for us is a strategic priority as South Africa during its chairship of BRICS. It is for this reason that we have chosen as the theme for this year's summit, BRICS and Africa, a partnership for mutually accelerated growth, sustainability, and inclusive multilateralism. We welcome the ongoing engagement of BRICS countries with Africa in the spirit of partnership and mutual respect. We are pleased that all BRICS members, Brazil is re-engaging with the African continent in a meaningful way. Russia has always had really good and meaningful relations with African countries. China has chosen to assist and support Africa with its aspirations for development. And all of us, in the ways that we are involved and engaged, we want to be engaged with Africa. India continues to increase its engagement and its trade with Africa. So as the BRICS family, all of us as members, we are deeply invested and deeply engaged with Africa. Our objectives are reciprocal trade and investment. We want the goods and products and services from Africa to compete on an equal footing on the global economy. The African Continental Free Trade Area, once fully operational, will unlock the the benefits of the continental market and generate mutually beneficial opportunities for both African and BRICS countries. As nations of the world confront the effects of climate change, we must ensure that the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient future is just, it must be fair, and it must be able to take into account the different circumstances that prevail in all countries. In line with this objective, BRICS nations need to advance the interests of the Global South and call for industrialized countries to honor their commitments to support climate actions by developing economic progress. The commitments of support that have been made that have not yet been lived up to need to be followed through. Peace and stability are preconditions for a better, more equitable world. We are deeply concerned about conflicts across the world that continue to cause a great deal of suffering and hardship to many people around the world. As South Africa, our position remains that diplomacy, dialogue, negotiation, and adherence to the principles of the United Nations Charter are necessary for the peaceful and just resolution of conflicts. We are concerned that global financial and payment systems are increasingly being used as instruments of geopolitical contestation. Global economic recovery relies on predictable global payment systems and the smooth operating of banking, supply chains, trade, tourism, as well as financial flows. We will continue discussions on practical measures to facilitate trade and investment flows through the increased use of local currencies. This is a matter we believe that further discussions need to take place, particularly amongst our finance ministers. The world is changing. New economic, political, social, and technological realities for greater cooperation between nations is essential. New realities call for a fundamental reform of the institutions of global governance so that they may be more representative and better able to respond to the challenges that confront humanity. While many believe that we should advance the interests of all people, we believe that, yes, as we advance them, the interests of the Global South, that we as BRICS want to be ready to advance are essential, and in this regard, we want to collaborate more, to cooperate more with all countries that aspire to create a more inclusive international order. We are confident that this 15th BRICS Summit will advance the cause of common prosperity and progress. We are confident that this 15th BRICS Summit will, in the end, enrich and inspire our work towards the achievement of a much more humane global community. This is what BRICS is all about. This is what BRICS is committed to achieving. It is a great honor for us as South Africa to have this opportunity to host this 15th BRICS Summit and to have in our presence the BRICS members as they are represented here. And with those words, I open this session and then call upon one of the young leaders of our country who is also going to have an opportunity to give the words of welcome, but also to give the hope that young people in the BRICS countries hope to communicate to all of us. I call upon Ms. Asanda Luaga to speak to us. She is the chairperson of the Board of Directors of the National Youth Development Agency that seeks to advance the interests of young people in South Africa. Ms. Ayanda.
Thank you very much, Honorable President. Your Excellencies and the heads of states of the BRICS countries, ministers and deputy ministers present, members of the media, leaders of business, civil society and labor, young people. It gives me great pleasure to deliver a statement on behalf of young people to the BRICS Heads of State Summit. Young people make up a large proportion of the populations of each of our respective countries. Their voices and views are critical as we forge a post-pandemic society at the highest decision.
All right, so we are watching the BRICS summit taking place in the South African city of Johannesburg. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. We've just heard from the South African President, Cyril Ramaphos, who was who was opening the summit and welcoming everyone who's attending. He talked about the partnership of the countries straddling 4 continents, home to 3.5 billion people, and of how the bloc has been a major driver of global growth, trade and investment, he said, over the past 15 years. Well, listening into President Cyril Ramaphosa is our correspondent, Fahmida Miller, and she's joining us live from Johannesburg. And Fahmida, Cyril Ramaphosa really stressing the focus on Africa this year, saying that the theme for this year's summit is BRICS and Africa, a partnership, he said, for mutually accelerated growth and inclusive multilateralism. And that is a theme he touched on throughout his address.
And if we go back to the start of his address, he used some of those words you've just mentioned, inclusivity and more equitable global order. South Africa has also invited a number of heads of state from other African countries. And this is in line with South Africa's policy in terms of supporting African countries, developing countries, and trying to boost their economies and development and growth. He's also said and used this phrase, sustainable development. And this is what South Africa is looking to within this BRICS bloc, is that this is a grouping of influential countries, emerging economies that can help drive sustainable and inclusive growth across Africa. And this is what is important to South Africa in terms of its own development. If the African continent grows, South Africa will benefit. We know that BRICS is looking at expansion, but we also know that there hasn't been complete consensus around that. A country like South Africa wants that expansion, so does Russia, but countries like Brazil and India are concerned that should the group grow, its influence globally might be diluted. So we're waiting to hear more from other leaders here at the summit around these outcomes, around who will be admitted, why that is, and how it will be mutually beneficial. But a number of the key issues, of course, around climate change, economy, and essentially creating a counterweight to Western geopolitical dominance, economic and geopolitical dominance, Elizabeth.
Yeah, really interesting. You talk about President Ramaphosa talking about development, and he said that the Western world, that industrialized nations, have a responsibility to support the development of African countries. And he tied that in with climate change, actually, didn't he, Fahmida? He said that that countries, industrialized nations, must ensure that the transition to a low-carbon future is just and fair and takes into account different circumstances in all countries, and that countries of the global south cannot develop unless these things are taken into consideration?
And Elizabeth, that does go back to the issue around an equal footing for the member states of BRICS and those who may join. And again, as you mentioned, they're related to climate change in that they want the country globally, those who have committed to various promises to stick to them and carry them through. And this BRICS summit, the expectation is that this group of countries will potentially hold these countries accountable. Developing nations.
Fahmida, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt you, Fahmida, because
in terms of coming together.
Thank you, Fahmida. We are going to go back to the summit and listen live because I believe the Brazilian president, Luiz Inacia Lula da Silva, is about to speak. Let's listen in.
The People's Republic of China and my dear sister, Dilma Rousseff, the CEO of the New Development Bank, State Ministers of Brazil that are in my delegation, Mauro Vieira of Foreign Affairs, Fernando Haddad, Finance Minister of Brazil, Aniele Franco for Racial Equality, Ambassador Celso Amorim, Special International Advisor of the President, and my dear wife, Janja. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Business Forum of the BRICS, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Women's Entrepreneurial Alliance, and Madam Limbo Gazulu, representative of the Business Alliance of Women of BRICS, and the youth member, Asanda Luaka. Dear friends, it's with great joy to come back to Johannesburg, the city that was a very important stage of struggle against apartheid and that continues to inspire us to fight all forms of discrimination and inequality. The last time that I participated in this summit meeting, 2010, I had the honor to host in Brasilia, our capital, the heads of state and government of Russia, India, and China, besides South Africa, that participated as a candidate to become member of the BRICS. Only 1 year after that meeting, we confirmed that South Africa would join the BRICS in the first expansion of our grouping. Its inclusion made that we could better reflect the new confederation of the world power. We left that meeting strengthened. Today, we represent 41% of the world population, and we are responsible for 31% of the global GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. But we face a more complex scenario than when we met for the very first time. In few years, we went back from a benign multipolarity juncture to going back to an absolute mindset of Cold War and geopolitical competition. This is lack of the senses that generates great uncertainty and corrodes multilateralism. We know very well where this path could take us. The world needs to understand the risks that are involved and which are unacceptable for humanity. The BRICS, we should say that all suffer the consequences of the war. The most vulnerable population in the developing countries are the ones that are hit more in an unproportional way. The Ukraine war shows the limitations of the UN Security Council. Many other conflicts and crises do not have the same attention, and the BRICS is a forum to discuss the main issues that affect peace and world security. We cannot bypass the treat. The main conflict of today that is happening in Ukraine that has global effects. Brazil has an historical position in the defense of the sovereignty and integrity of the territory and of all the principles that are followed by the UN. We believe that it is positive that a growing number of countries, amongst them the BRICS countries, also are engaged in direct contact with Moscow and with Kiev. We do not underestimate the difficulties to reach peace, And either we can be indifferent to the deaths and the destruction that increase every day. Brazil does not contemplate unilateral formulas for peace. We are ready to join efforts that we can effectively contribute for immediate ceasefire and a fair and everlasting peace. Everybody suffers with the consequences of the war. The most vulnerable population in the developing countries are the ones that are reached in an unproportional way. The Ukraine war shows the limitations of the UN Security Council. Many other conflicts and crises do not receive the due attention, even causing a vast suffering for their peoples. Haitians, Yemenites, Syrian, Libyans, and Sudanese, and Palestinians all deserve to live in peace. It is unacceptable that global military spending in 1 year goes beyond $2 trillion, while the FAO says to us that 735 million people are in hunger every day in the world. The quest for peace is a collective obligation and an imperative for a fair development and sustainable development. The BRICS should act as a force for understanding and for cooperation. Our willingness is expressed in the contributions given by China, South Africa, and from my own country in all the endeavors to conflict resolution in Ukraine. There are many places while men go to war, the women are the ones that fight for conciliation. The valuation and the strengthening of the role of women in the resolution of conflicts will be more and more central for peace in the world. And more than that, the women's empowerment is a precondition for a full socioeconomic development. And paraphrasing Thomas Sankara, a great Pan-African leader, which says, we cannot hope for a society where half of the population is silenced by male chauvinism and by discrimination in political participation and in the world of labor. Dear friends, the weakening of the global governance is also clear in the development agendas, in financing, and in the confrontation with climate change. When I came back to the presidency in Brazil, I was very sad to see that the implementation of the 2030 agenda is under risk in all the world. A recent report from the UN indicates that we're in a strong backwardness. We see the greatest increase of inequality between the countries in more than in the last 3 decades. In 30% of the goals, we stagnated or we're going backwards. It's very difficult to fight climate change while many developing countries still have to deal with hunger, poverty, and other kinds of violence. The principle of common and shared responsibility, but differentiated, is something that is true till today. The major response for the carbon emissions that cause the climate change were those countries that made their industrial revolution and feeded predatory colonial extractivism. They have an historical debt with the planet Earth and with humanity. We need to value the Paris Agreement and the Climate Convention instead of outsourcing climate responsibilities for the global South. Brazil is recovering its protagonism on the environmental agenda. The coordination with other developing countries that carry tropical forests to act as the climate change copes and biodiversity copes will be vital to give way to our interests. In the summit meeting, the Amazon rainforest that was held some days ago was a landmark for the necessary construction of a sustainable development model with more fairness. Our resources should not be exploited for the benefit of few, but valued and placed to service all, and above all, for the well-being of the local populations. And more than that, so that the promises that were already done by the rich countries should be fulfilled, climate financing and biodiversity should be truly new and additional in relationship to the traditional financing to development. We need an international financial system that, instead of feeding the inequalities, should help the medium and low-income countries to implement structural changes. This will only happen with an adequate representation of the Bretton Woods institutions and their climatic funds. Foreign indebtedness refrains sustainable development. It's inadmissible that the developing countries should be penalized with interest rates that are 8 times higher than the ones that are charged in the rich countries. It is necessary to increase liquidity, to enhance concessional financing, and last but not the least, the conditionalities. The trade multilateral system should be reactivated so it can come back and act as a tool for fair trade, predictable, equitable, and non-discriminatory. No one anymore remembers the development round of the WTO. The decarbonization of our economies should be followed by the job creation with dignity, industrialization, and green infrastructure and public services for all. Through the new development bank, we can offer our own alternatives for adequate financing that will attend or meet the needs of the global South. I'm sure that under the leadership of my sister Dilma Rousseff, the bank will manage to face these challenges. The creation of a common valued unit for our trade transactions and investments for the BRICS countries will increase our payment options and reduce our vulnerabilities. Presidents, today, and guests, today the BRICS are fully consolidated as a brand and as a political asset of strategic value. The participation of dozens of heads of government and state tomorrow in the enhanced session will represent an historical landmark. The interest of many countries to join the BRICS is the recognition of its growing relevance. And also, we will have a troika at the G20 as members of the BRICS in the period 2023. And so it's another opportunity for us to make advancement of the concerns of the global South with the inequalities and with sustainable development. That the momentum that motivated the creation of BRICS 15 years ago continue to inspire us in building a multipolar, fair, and inclusive international order. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Lula da Silva.
Okay, so we've just heard from the Brazilian President Luiz Inacia Lula da Silva. He is speaking at the 5th BRICS summit, that is the summit of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, taking place in the South African city of Johannesburg, very much echoing what the South African President Cyril Ramaphos was saying, which was talking about the need for a multipolar, for a fair and inclusive order. I want to bring in our correspondent, Fahmida, who I believe has been listening into the Brazilian President Lula da Silva speaking. And Fahmida, it was really interesting that President Lula, he went into more detail about one of the biggest issues at this summit. In fact, one of the biggest issues, global issues in the world today that all summits are addressing, which is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Lula was very careful, wasn't he, to condemn the Russian invasion. He said that that Brazil supports the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but at the same time, he said that the Ukraine war shows the limitation of the UN Security Council, that many other conflicts don't have the same attention. He went on to say that the Sudanese, that Palestinians all deserve to live in peace.
And he did use that opportunity to, as you say, to some extent criticize the structures within the United Nations, specifically the Security Council. And as you say, that there's a limitation to what it can do and that all people deserve to live in peace. That global security continues to be an issue for BRICS, and this is what BRICS stands for. And so ultimately, I think we can interpret from what he has said that BRICS aims to deal with and address the issue of global peace as well as conflict in a way that is different to the United Nations and perhaps the Western dominance that is seen within those structures. While he has wanted to tread lightly with Russia's role in that, he has wanted to bring attention to potentially
Fahmida, I'm sorry to do this to you again. I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Fahmida, but we're now hearing from Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is attending via video link. Let's listen in.
Distinguished Prime Minister Modi, President Xi, dear colleagues, at the outset, I would like to thank South African friends for what they have done during their presidency, during their chairmanship this year. The colleagues before me have already given positive assessment of the BRICS activities. And in general, certainly we share these assessments. Our group of 5 countries has rightly proved to be a credible entity on the global arena with ever-growing influence in global affairs. The strategic course of BRICS is aimed at the future, and it meets the aspirations of the main part of the international community, the so-called global majority. By acting in concert on the principles of equality, partnership, support, and account for each other's interests, we deal with the most pressing issues of global and regional agenda. The main important thing is that BRICS stands for a multipolar world order that is equitable and built on international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter, including respect for the right of every people to its own development path. Some countries promote their hegemony, exceptionality, and their policy of the ongoing colonialism and neo-colonialism. I would like to note that the aspiration to preserve their hegemony in the world led to a dire crisis in Ukraine. At first, with the help of Western countries, an anti-constitutional coup d'etat was carried out in this country. After that, those people who did not agree with this coup faced a war. A war was unleashed against them, a war of attrition, and it lasted for 8 years. Russia decided to support people that fight for their culture, for their traditions, for their language and their future. Our actions in Ukraine are guided by only one thing: to put an end to the war that was unleashed by the West against people in Donbass. We thank our colleagues within BRICS that take an active part in the attempts to put an end to this situation and to ensure just settlement by peaceful means. Dear colleagues, the main thing is that we unanimously stand for the shaping of the multipolar world order, which is genuinely equitable and which is building on international law. The BRICS countries are building up their potential. As was said, the BRICS countries are home to over 3 billion persons, and their share in global GDP as per purchasing power parity of the so-called G7. Over the past decades, BRICS investment to global economy have doubled, and the cumulative export reached 20% of the overall indicator. We are successfully implementing the strategy for BRICS Economic Partnership 2025. Namely, we are strengthening the bilateral cooperation on such areas as diversification of supply chains, de-dollarization and transfer to local currencies in our mutual settlements, digital economy, support for small and medium enterprises, just transfer of technologies, And naturally, the active part in this process is played by business community. A great deal of effort is invested within the BRICS Business Council and the BRICS Women's Business Alliance that the host of our meeting, President Ramaphos, indicated. The leaders of these organizations are present at this meeting. An important priority for the BRICS interaction is the establishment of new, sustainable, safe transport routes. In my address to the BRICS Business Forum, I talked about the importance of a speedy development of transcontinental routes, such as the North-South corridor that would link Russian Northern Sea and Baltic ports to sea terminals in the Gulf and in the Indian Ocean. In the future, it would ensure the annual transit of up to 30 million tons of cargo. We believe that it is high time to establish a BRICS Permanent Commission on Transport that would deal not only with the North-South project, but in broader terms, it would deal with logistics and transport corridors development, both interregional and global ones. Should the partners agree to that, the Russian side could work on this idea within its chairmanship in 2024. And certainly, we welcome strengthened interaction within BRICS in terms of global innovations. We look forward to a more active cooperation within the BRICS Global Research Advanced Infrastructure Network. It could be supported and developed by the Special Trust Fund. For its part, Russia is ready to share its experience and best practices, including when it comes to digital transformation and the use of artificial intelligence. We also seek to actively participate in the implementation of the achieved arrangements on the establishment of the Joint Working Group on Nuclear Medicine. We seek to swiftly switch into practice the work of the BRICS TVET Cooperation Alliance. We wholeheartedly support the proposal of South African colleagues to organize a separate ministerial on women affairs. Their role in political, economic and social life of our states should definitely be enhanced. Dear colleagues, next year, Russia will assume BRICS chairmanship. Our chairmanship will have the following motto: strengthening multilateralism for just global development and security. We plan to have some 200 political, economic and public events that will be hosted by over a dozen Russian cities. At the same time, the BRICS summit is scheduled for October 2024. It will take place in the city of Kazan. The specific dates will be agreed upon with colleagues via diplomatic channels. We'll also have events in the format that has proved its relevance. I'm talking about BRICS Plus and BRICS Outreach. During our chairmanship, we would like to do our utmost to efficiently facilitate the implementation of decisions adopted at this summit, including with regard to the expansion of BRICS. We will coordinate closely with partners on foreign policy matters. We will jointly work on key international platforms, primarily within the United Nations. We will continue regular meetings of BRICS national security advisors. Certainly, we will prioritize such urgent tasks as combating terrorism and the spread of terrorist ideology, as well as combating money laundering and return of assets gained by criminal means. By the way, we thank partners for their support within the Financial Action Task Force. We hope that we will keep such spirit of solidarity in the future. We will contribute to comprehensive implementation of the Strategy for BRICS Economic Partnership 2025 and the development of new long-term guidelines for cooperation. This includes, in our view, increasing the role of states in international monetary and financial system, the development of interbank cooperation, expanding the use of local currencies and deepening interaction between tax, customs and anti-monopoly agencies. Naturally, Russian priorities include bolstered partnership in science and innovation, healthcare, education, the development of humanitarian ties in general. Cultural and civilizational diversity is one of the pillars of the new multipolar world order, and it means the establishment of integral free space for cultural exchange, art and creativity. As we see it, it's high time for partners within BRICS, as well as the SCO and the Community of Independent States and other countries, to have a serious conversation on the future of culture in the world, on preserving and multiplying global cultural heritage. By the way, such dialogue could be held within the 9th International Cultural Forum, which is scheduled to take place in the city of St. Petersburg from November 16th to 18th. And certainly, Russia will continue to contribute to contacts in sports and youth exchanges. Namely, in June 2024, we plan to have the BRICS Games. We would be happy to welcome teams from the BRICS nations at the next year's international competition, the Games of the Future. They will take place in the city of Kazan. This is a mix of dynamic sports and popular video games and technological devices. A good opportunity for contacts and friendly talks will be given by the World Youth Festival that will take place in March next year in the city of Sochi. In conclusion, let me once again highlight that Russia, during its chairmanship, will interact in the most constructive way with BRICS partners in order to further enhance the role and credibility of BRICS. Without any doubt, this credibility will only grow. Thank you for your attention.
All right, we have been listening there to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is addressing the BRICS summit, that is the summit of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, the 15th BRICS summit that's taking place in the South African city of Johannesburg, and President Putin talking about the world, that they were addressing the most pressing issues of global and regional agendas. He also said that BRICS stands for a multipolar world that is equitable, built on international law, he said, and the principles of the UN Charter. He also went on to talk about what's led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, though he didn't use those words, of course. Our correspondent Fahmida has been listening into all of these addresses by the leaders, and she's joining us live from Johannesburg. And interestingly, but perhaps not a surprise, that President Putin described the war in Ukraine. He said at first it was with the help of Western countries that a coup was carried out, presumably referring to the 2014 protest that led to the ouster of President Viktor Yanukovych, who was seen by the people protesting as being too close to Russia. He said that a coup was carried out and a war of attrition was unleashed on those who didn't support the coup, and that Russia's actions in Ukraine are guided by one thing: to put an end to the war that was unleashed by people in the Donbass. And then he went to thank colleagues in BRICS who've tried to, he said, put an end to this solution. But before we get to all of that, Fahmida, let's just remind our viewers why President Putin is not appearing in person like the other leaders and via video link.
Well, the build-up to this summit was a very controversial one. And this, of course, because the Russian President Vladimir Putin had been issued with a warrant of arrest by the International Criminal Court for alleged crimes linked to this war in the Ukraine. Now, South Africa found itself in a very difficult position as hosts of the summit, really in a legal bind, not knowing what would happen should Putin come to South Africa, if they'd be obliged to arrest him. Of course, South Africa is a signatory to the Rome Statute, and analysts have argued would, of course, then be obligated to arrest the Russian president. There was a lot of debate in South Africa, reaching the highest level of government in terms of what should happen. And then eventually a sigh of relief, we imagine, for the South African government, in that Putin decided to remain in Russia and instead, as you say, attend the summit virtually. Now, he's used that opportunity to defend Russia's position in Ukraine, its invasion of Ukraine, explaining why Russia has done that, defending, it says, the people of Donbass, their identity, their culture. He really set the tone using the situation in Ukraine to explain Russia's agenda and ultimately looking at, and again we're hearing this, an equitable global order, Elizabeth.
All right, Fahmida, thank you for that. Fahmida Miller in Johannesburg. Let's go back to the summit to hear from the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Ladies and gentlemen, 15वें ब्रिक्स समिट के भव्य आयोजन
My congratulations and thanks once again to my dear friend, President Ramaphos, for the wonderful arrangements made for the organization of the 15th BRICS Summit and for his hospitality. It is a great pleasure for me.
É grande prazer para mim.
इस शहर का भारत के लोगों और भारत के इतिहास से पुराना गहरा संबंध है। यहाँ से कुछ दूर ही टॉल्स्टॉय फार्म है, जिसका निर्माण महात्मा गांधी ने 110 वर्ष पहले किया था।
Years ago,
भारत
built 110 years ago by bringing together the great philosophies of Eurasia and Africa. Mahatma Gandhi laid a strong foundation for our unity and mutual harmony. Excellencies, the last 2 decades have been a long and magnificent journey for BRICS. We have had many achievements during this journey. Our new development bank is playing an important role in the development of the countries of the Global South. Through its contingency reserve arrangement, we have created a financial safety net. Through initiatives such as the BRICS satellite constellation, the Vaccine R&D Center, mutual recognition of pharma products, we are bringing about positive changes in the lives of ordinary citizens in BRICS countries. Through initiatives such as the Youth Summit, BRICS Games, the Think Tanks Council, we are strengthening people-to-people ties between all countries. In order to give the BRICS agenda new direction, India has given some suggestions, such as the Railway Research Network, the online BRICS database, close cooperation between MSMEs, and a startup forum. I am pleased that significant progress has been made in all these areas. Excellencies, in order to further expand our close cooperation, I would like to place before you a few suggestions. The first is cooperation in the area of space. We have already been working on a BRICS satellite constellation. Taking a step forward, we can think about creating a BRICS space exploration consortium. Under this, we can work on areas such as space research and weather monitoring for global good. My second suggestion is cooperation in the areas of education, skill development, and technology. In order to make BRICS a future-ready organization, we must make our societies future-ready. Technology can play an important role in this regard. In order to provide access to education for children living in remote and rural areas in India, we have created the Diksha platform, that is digital infrastructure for knowledge sharing. At the same time, in order to promote innovation among school children, we have created 10,000 Atal tinkering labs across the country in order to remove language barriers. An AI-based language platform, Bhashini, is being used. The CoWIN platform has been made to manage vaccinations through our digital public infrastructure, that is the India stack. Public service delivery is being revolutionized. Diversity is one of India's greatest strengths. The solution to any problem found in India has withstood the test of this diversity, and therefore these solutions can easily be implemented in any part of the world. In this regard, we will be pleased to share with BRICS partners all these platforms developed in India. My third suggestion is that in order to identify each other's strengths, we can carry out together a skills mapping exercise. Through this, we can complement each other in the development journey. My fourth suggestion relates to big cats. In all 5 BRICS countries, various species of big cats can be found in large numbers. Under the International Big Cat Alliance, we can make joint efforts for their protection. My fifth suggestion relates to traditional medicine. All our countries have traditional medicine ecosystems. Can we together create a repository of traditional medicine? Excellencies, under South Africa's presidency, countries of the Global South have been given special importance in BRICS. We heartily welcome this. This is not just an expectation of the present times, but a necessity as well. Under its G20 presidency, India has given this subject the highest priority. Based on our core value, one earth, one family, one future, we are making efforts to move forward together with all countries. In the Voice of Global South Summit organized in January earlier this year, 125 countries participated and shared their concerns and priorities. We have also proposed permanent membership for the African Union in the G20. I am confident that all BRIC partners are also together in the G20 and that all will support our proposal. Giving a special place to all these efforts within BRICS as well will further boost the morale of countries of the Global South. Excellencies, India fully supports the expansion of BRICS membership, and we welcome moving forward on this based on consensus. In 2016, during India's presidency, we had defined BRICS as a group building responsive, inclusive, and collective solutions. 7 years later, we can say that BRICS will be breaking barriers, revitalizing economies, inspiring innovation, creating opportunities, and shaping the future. Together with all BRICS partners, we will continue to contribute actively to make this new definition meaningful. Thank you.
And we have been listening there to the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, addressing the BRICS summit, the 15th BRICS summit that's taking place in the South African city of Johannesburg. Let's bring in our correspondent, Fahmida. She is listening in to all of these addresses, and she's joining us live from Johannesburg. And the Prime Minister speaking about fully supporting the expansion of BRICS. He said that he had some suggestions that will take the grouping forward. What I found really interesting, Fahmida, is we heard from Cyril Ramaphosa, from Luiz Inacia Lula da Silva, from Vladimir Putin about the war in Ukraine and how much it's shaping the world that we are living in, the challenges that it's posing. But no mention of that from the Indian Prime Minister, and perhaps surprisingly not.
I think that two issues that he stayed away from was the local currencies, the issue of greater trade in the individual currencies of these member states. And he did say we fully support expansion, but he didn't go into as much detail as the other leaders. And what we've heard so far is that India hasn't been as encouraging around the expansion of this BRICS grouping. The grouping and the expansion of it could possibly bring a greater number of members, would potentially bring greater influence. India has said that it's worried about that influence globally being diluted, and so there hasn't been consensus around that specific issue. But Modi did really stress specific areas of cooperation, everything from traditional medicine to space exploration. And it sounded as if his address was really based around the existing BRICS members rather than moving it forward and how it could be inclusive on a broader scale compared to the other leaders who spoke about an equitable global order. Ultimately, what we're hearing there is a realignment of the global order dealing with politics to the economy, a little bit different from what Modi focused on, Elizabeth.
And Fahmida, I said it's that is not surprising that, he didn't mention the sort of elephant in the room, I suppose, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the problems that that's thrown up, because India, perhaps more than any other country, Brazil is close, but India in this group of nations is the one that wants to be closest to America and to the West, and is trying to strike this balancing act between BRICS and Russia and China on one hand, and the US and the West on the other hand. And this is just one of the many divergences that are present in this summit.
Well, Modi's certainly wanting to tread carefully, given his recent visits to Europe, to France and to the US, and wanting to protect those relationships both politically and economically. It's the same position that South Africa is finding itself in. The South African Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor, has made stronger statements with regard to Russia, as you're asking about there, in terms of a sort of pressure to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, condemn the war there. South Africa hasn't done that and has said it remains neutral. But then we also heard from South African President Cyril Ramaphosa this week saying that South Africa is non-aligned, but it doesn't mean that South Africa is neutral. So a slightly firmer stance there. So again, the position that India is facing in terms of ultimately taking sides, but wanting to protect its own national interest. Now, while all these countries have made fairly firm statements around an equitable world order, about funding of development, around the new BRICS Development Bank. They have also wanted to take care of their national interests, not jeopardize what they're looking for in terms of their representation and membership within BRICS. And this is certainly the position that India is finding itself in, having to juggle all its interests and not trying to alienate any of their development, economic or political partners.
And Fahmida, when you talk about how South Africa is also trying to walk that tightrope when it comes to, the balancing act of Russia and also Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West on the other hand, and we've talked about how President Putin appeared virtually to avoid an international arrest warrant for crimes against humanity committed during the war in Ukraine. Cyril Ramaphosa, he has spoken about the children. President Putin is facing this arrest warrant, being accused of abducting Ukrainian children and sending them to Russia. And President Cyril Ramaphosa has spoken about this, hasn't he?
He did in recent weeks, especially around the debate around what South Africa would do around Putin's potential presence in South Africa. And, that's been made clear through this virtual presentation by the Russian president that he would not be attending. But South Africa has said that what is important is addressing the difficulties, if you could call it that, around Ukraine in a diplomatic manner. South Africa seems to be deepening its cooperation with Russia, especially economically, Russia wanting far more influence in Africa, even related to trade routes. And so its emphasis from South Africa has been dealing with this diplomatically and not wanting to say the wrong thing.
Fahmida, thank you very much for that. That's Fahmida Miller live in Johannesburg. Let's go back to the summit now because the Chinese President Xi Jinping is about to speak. Let's listen in.
We gather at a time when the world is undergoing major shifts, division and regrouping. It has entered a new period of turbulence and transformation. We, the BRICS countries, should always bear in mind our founding purpose of strengthening ourselves through unity, act on a strong sense of responsibility, enhance cooperation across the board, and promote high-quality development so as to bring to the world more certainty, stability, and a positive energy. We should deepen business and financial cooperation to boost economic growth. Development is an inalienable right of all countries. It is not a privilege reserved for a few. The world economic recovery remains shaky, with less than 3% of growth for the year, as estimated by some international institutions. Challenges for developing countries are even more formidable, hampering their efforts to realize the sustainable development goals. We BRICS countries should be fellow companions on the journey of development and revitalization, and oppose decoupling and supply chains disruption, as well as economic coercion. We should focus on practical cooperation, particularly in such fields as digital economy, green development, and supply chain, and bolster economic, trade, and financial exchanges. China will set up a China BRICS Science and Innovation Incubation Park for the new era to support the deployment of innovation results. Under the BRICS Remote Sensing Satellite Constellation Mechanism, we will explore the establishment of a BRICS Global Remote Sensing Satellite Data and Application Cooperation Platform to provide data support for agriculture, ecological conservation, and disaster reduction in various countries. China will also work with all parties to jointly establish a BRICS framework on industrial cooperation for sustainable development as a platform of industrial coordination and project cooperation in implementing the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We should expand political and security cooperation to uphold peace and tranquility. The Cold War mentality is still haunting our world, and the geopolitical situation is getting tense. BRICS countries should keep to the direction of peaceful development and consolidate the BRICS strategic partnership. We need to make good use of the BRICS Foreign Ministers meeting, the meeting of high representatives on national security and other mechanisms, support each other on issues concerning our respective core interests, and enhance coordination on major international and regional issues. we need to tender good offices on hotspot issues, pushing for political settlement and lowering the temperature. Artificial intelligence is a new frontier of development. It may generate enormous development dividends, but also harbors risks and challenges. Our 5 countries have agreed to launch the AI study group of BRICS Institute of Future Networks at an early date. We need to enable the study group to play its full role, further expand cooperation on AI, and step up information exchange and technological cooperation. We need to jointly fend off risks and develop AI governance frameworks and standards with broad-based consensus. So as to make AI technologies more secure, reliable, controllable, and equitable. We should increase people-to-people exchanges and promote mutual learning between civilizations. There are many civilizations and development paths in the world, and this is how the world should be. Human history will not end with a particular civilization or system. BRICS countries need to champion the spirit of inclusiveness and advocate peaceful coexistence and harmony between civilizations. We should respect all modernization paths that each country chooses on its own, and oppose ideological rivalry, systemic confrontation, and clash of civilizations. We need to make good use of such mechanisms as the BRICS Seminar on Governance, the BRICS Forum on People-to-People and Cultural Exchanges, and the Women Innovation Contest to deepen people-to-people exchanges and strengthen the bond between our peoples. China would like to propose that BRICS countries expand cooperation on education, enhance the role of the BRICS Alliance for vocational education, explore and set up a cooperation mechanism on digital education, and foster a paradigm of all-round cooperation on education. In addition, we also need to strengthen exchanges on traditional cultures and promote the renewal of the fine traditional cultures. We should uphold fairness and justice and improve global governance. Strengthening global governance is the right choice if the international community intends to share development opportunities and tackle global challenges. International rules must be written and upheld jointly by all countries, based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, rather than dictated by those with the strongest muscles or the loudest voice. Ganging up to form exclusive groups and packaging their own rules as international norms are even more unacceptable. BRICS countries should practice true multilateralism, stick to solidarity and oppose division, uphold the UN-centered international system, support and strengthen the WTO-centered multilateral trading system, and reject the attempt to create small circles or exclusive blocs. We need to fully leverage the role of the new development bank, push forward reform of the international financial and monetary systems, and increase the representation and voice of developing countries. I am glad to see the growing enthusiasm of developing countries about BRICS, about participating in BRICS cooperation, and quite a number of them have applied to join the BRICS cooperation mechanism. We need to make good use of the BRICS Plus cooperation format and accelerate the BRICS expansion process to bring more countries into the BRICS family, so as to pool our strengths, pool our wisdom to make global governance more just and equitable. Colleagues, as an ancient Chinese saying goes, designs for justice prevail, and acts for the benefit of the people succeed. The cause of BRICS champions international justice and benefits the peoples of our 5 countries. It will grow steady and strong and make greater contributions to world peace and development. Thank you.
And we've been listening there to the Chinese President Xi Jinping addressing the 15th BRICS summit. That's the summit of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa that's taking place in the South African, of course, city of Johannesburg. And President Xi talking about how the world has entered a new period of turbulence. He spoke about a return to what he said the Cold War mentality, or rather said that the Cold War mentality is still haunting our world, and that the summit needs to make good use of the foreign ministers meeting, that they have to support each other and enhance coordination on major international issues and push for political settlement, he said, on international issues, on conflicts, and also lower the temperature. Let's bring in Fahmida. She's our correspondent who is joining us live from Johannesburg and who's been listening in to the statements by all of the leaders. And interestingly, Fahmida, it was President Xi of China and President Putin who spoke most about what they said was either a return to Cold War mentality. In fact, the Brazilian president, Luiz Lula da Silva, also touched on this, saying that the world is returning to a Cold War mentality, they said, and how a dangerous a path that is.
And what is interesting is this is potentially where we could see some difficulty in them reaching consensus around what exactly happens next, because we also heard Lula da Silva on Tuesday talk about how BRICS is not is not trying to compete with the West. And that's potentially where these member states would have to find a firm platform, a firm view in terms of what BRICS represents. We've heard repeatedly about an equitable system, an equitable global order. Ultimately, I think some of the rhetoric coming out has been one around realigning the global order and creating a greater platform for the member states of BRICS, as well as other and developing nations, those who could potentially join. China, I think some of these countries have so far tried to tread lightly and be as diplomatic as possible, but at the same time remaining firm around what BRICS wants to achieve and being that alternative for its member states, and possibly creating an alternative to the G20, to the G7. China has been pushing for expansion of the group. A country like India is a little bit more wary, not wanting to empower potentially China within the BRICS group, because that's also a relationship where there has been some strain. And at the same time, China has seen increasing strain with the West and want to bolster the power of the BRICS grouping.
Fahmida, thank you very much for that. That's our correspondent, Fahmida Miller, joining us live from Johannesburg. We are going to stay with this story. We're joined now by Irina Murasan. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and she's joining us live from Johannesburg too. Thank you very much for your time. I know that you've been listening to all of these world leaders talking about the need for a multipolar world. Is there anything that stood out for you?
Just how the BRICS are reiterating, the unifying factor that their voices were not well represented across other institutions like IMF, World Bank, as we're hearing. The global order is changing, and the pressure is on that the original post-World War II infrastructure does not resonate to the challenges of war. So there's this resurgence as well of non-alignment, noting that these impacts are on how the BRICS and the BRICS Plus experience geopolitical tensions and developments.
And the latest gathering of leaders, it's the 15th summit, it's garnered a level of international interest that we've rarely seen since the group was first formed. Why do you think that is?
I think this time all eyes are on expansion. And as we've been saying, there's the positives with some of the proposed members. It also, there's the possibility to see strategic heights it could achieve with some of the proposed members. And others are actually pressing that it dilutes BRICS' influence potentially. And realistically, the partnership is open to other geopolitical pressures of other potential members. So when you look at the formal expansion, the realistic way it can happen very fast or very slow. But all eyes are definitely on this idea of expansion going forward.
And how does the group decide who they allow in? A few of the members, I think that Prime Minister Narendra, for instance, has spoken about how he and how India fully support the expansion. But how do they decide?
At the end of the day, it is very much a closed discussion. We haven't seen a criteria yet. We are looking mostly to ministerial level where this could be worked upon and discussed, communicated as well. But when you look at the modalities of the practical engagement, it's very vast spanning. So you have interministerial level of discussion, then you have institutionalized platforms finding government traction like your New Development Bank, think tanks, business, and lastly, dialogue fora like civil society, political parties, labor, etc. But here, it's important to look at pockets of excellence. So like the bank, what expansion could mean for the grouping. So it's since it expanded in 2022, they're saying, they're looking at a potential 15 extra members, and new development leadership has really been staffed by BRICS treasury members and business. So there are high degrees of policy alignment here. And in addition to that, it's important to consider what other kinds of consolidated regional partners could be brought in as official observers or included in other fora.
Okay. One thing that was really interesting is that President Vladimir Putin appeared virtually, and that is, of course, to avoid an international arrest warrant for crimes against humanity committed during the war in Ukraine. Dozens of countries, as we've mentioned, have expressed interest in joining. I mean, what does this tell us about how Russia is viewed outside of the West since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, and how that doesn't seem to have changed in the past year?
Well, when you look at how they've approached the war in Ukraine, for example, it's from a pragmatic perspective as well. It's important for them to understand where they're coming from in terms of their national interests. And I think more than ever in 2023 going forward, that's what resonates most. And it's not that solidarity with Ukraine in terms of the suffering that is ongoing. It's not that does not resonate, but it is also important to continue to have a strategic, pragmatic agenda in this world. As we've been saying, it's hard to navigate when political power is centered in certain poles or certain areas. There's particular, when you think about polarity and how it's accepted in various places of the world, at the end of the day, it's how well you're able to advocate for your interests. And that is what is coming out strongest.
All right, that is Irina Murisan of the Institute for Global Dialogue joining us from Johannesburg. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.